Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay. Welcome to episode 144. I'm speaking with Berj Bannayan, one of the founders of Soho VFX. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Allan McKay podcast. Allan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Allan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Allan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on allanmckay.com.
All right, welcome to a brand new episode. So, just a quick update. I just want to mention this really quickly. As the last couple episodes, I'd mentioned some free training that had been in the works. And the cutoff I had mentioned was last week. And I just want to mention that there's been a bit of a mix-up, and this is completely all my fault. I had to fly to LA to do a quick Marvel gig, and then I had to go to Vegas, and so I had like a bunch of traveling leading up to the big launch. And because of that, I had to preload some of the episodes and do the recordings. Which in the episodes I always talk about batching your tasks, getting stuff done. Unfortunately, the dates and everything had obviously changed after I had recorded those. So the interesting thing was that I had mentioned there's some free training Energy Ball, which I had like a pretty basic idea of what I wanted to do. And to make it more interesting, I decided instead to email everyone on my Inner Circle email list. And if you're not part of that, just go to allanmckay.com/inside to sign up. It's free. And what this meant was that I had everyone submit ideas to me, and I had about 1,500 ideas submitted as to what kind of visual effects training you would want to see. And a lot of them were quite similar. There's a lot of car crashes, truck crashes, plane crashes, helicopter crashes, a lot of stuff crashing. Venom's symbiote suit was a huge one. The ash dust effect from Avengers Infinity War was another. And I think because I had been posting a little bit about the plasma energy ball effect, that one got a lot of clout. So when I had everyone then vote, and we had a lot of people submitting votes, the top three were Venom, Avengers, and the Plasma, which won. So because of that, there was a bit of a delay, but I've been now going through and building all the training. So the training is still available if you're interested, and you simply need to sign up at allanmckay.com/plasma. Or you can use the original link as well, which I'd posted in the previous episodes. That will go there as well. But this has been really cool. And I mentioned this, I want to mention this because thousands of people have been signing up, and I've had hundreds of people showing me their work and all the things they're doing in the training. And it's just been really awesome just to see the excitement around this subject. And I definitely want to do more of this because it's just really fun to kind of, again, see all of the people who are learning so much, getting so much from it, and also what you're able to produce with it. So right now, this is 8 hours of free training spanned over 7 videos. The cool thing was I shot this all on a Red Epic weapon at 8K, down-rested to HD, and I did a LiDAR scan of the entire environment. So you actually have a completely accurate 3D model of the entire environment as well, on top of the footage, the scene files, everything else. So it's really cool because I get into relighting footage based on the geometry. We get into a lot of different stuff, but of course, a lot of effects, rendering, lighting, integration, compositing, lots of cool stuff. So anyway, check that out at allanmckay.com/plasma. I just wanted to mention that to clarify because I had been mentioning this training the past couple of weeks, and unfortunately that was right before I had to jump down to LA. And my entire schedule kind of got derailed. So check that out there. I just want to mention that really quickly. I've got a lot of really cool stuff coming up. Right after the launch, the website that I've mentioned a few times will be officially coming out. I wanted to wait until after the launch. And also the FXTD mentorship registration is open right now. Again, if you sign up to my email list, you'll get notification about that. Lots and lots of cool stuff coming up. So I've got a new guide on negotiating for artists coming out very soon as well. Again, that's going to be free. It's going to be a new guide that will be up on my website very soon. So lots of cool stuff. But anyway, I want to get into this episode. I'm really excited for this episode. It's with Berj Bannayan, one of the founders of Soho VFX. And we get into so much cool stuff. And I love this episode in particular because we dive into a lot of the origins of Soho VFX and also Berj's background as well. And again, having someone whose background is more from a technical standpoint rather than more of a creative one, and kind of bridging the two things together, I think it's going to be a really cool episode to get into. A lot of really great insights are shared. So that being said, I'd rather just get right into this episode. And again, I want to thank Berj for taking the time to do this. So that being said, let's dive in.
Yeah, my name is Berj Bannayan. I'm one of the owners and one of the supervisors at Soho VFX in Toronto.
Awesome. And I'm Australian, so I'm always going to butcher people's names and be like Burch and Sarah. And so awesome, man. And I was just kind of curious, like for you, obviously you didn't come from more of an artist background, but do you want to talk a little bit about how you got started? Did you always picture you would work in film, or what did you expect early on in your career to kind of end up?
Well, I'm a child of the 70s, so I grew up with Star Wars, and that was a big influence on me as a moviegoer, as a child, but also sort of thinking, hey, wow, this would be really something amazing to be able to do and be a part of. That sort of began in the early 80s, but of course, when I was 10 years old, so that didn't really turn into anything back then. But as I sort of moved my expectations of career and growth in getting towards university in the 90s, I thought, hey, this would be cool. And then I actually tried doing some of these things. I had an Amiga computer back in the mid 80s and was working on trying to do some modeling and
using
animation and that. And I discovered I was terrible at it, absolutely awful. And so I started to think, hey, maybe if I had some aptitude for software development. So I decided to start a degree in computer science and thought, hey, that's the industry's moving with computers. At the time, it was still fairly new, but I remember seeing, Jurassic Park and The Abyss and these big sort of computer heavy effects and decided to do it that way.
That's really cool.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of unique too, because I think most people, if they're like, hey, I'm not getting the results that I want in one thing, they're either going to decide, well, I'm just going to work harder or be ignorant to it, or, quit entirely. But for you, it's more, let me adapt and find something that for me comes naturally and kind of go that route. So I think it's really cool. For you, I guess, like, was there any area that you were specifically specializing in, or you just decided to go more the technical route and see where you landed up?
At the time, I mean, when I was in school, it was, again, still very sort of the computer animation and computer sort of digital effects side of things was still pretty new. I started university in, I think, 1993. So Jurassic Park was only a couple of years gone at that point. Toy Story hadn't come yet. And so all of these kind of digital things didn't really exist. So I started to look at the companies that make the software that do these things. And I looked at, back then it was Alias, who's now part of Autodesk, and Side Effects, who make Houdini. That's become incredibly fundamental in our industry.
And down the street from you.
Yeah, very close, actually. And I ended up doing, my university had sort of a co-op program where you would work for 4 months and go to school for 4 months. And I ended up at Side Effects. So working on, at the beginning, what was their sort of product at the time called Prisms. And then they were transitioning into the Houdini years as I was there. And so I got to be a part of an amazing team of software developers there. And just was able to be exposed to wide swaths of the industry because they had such a diverse set of clients. And then I decided I would transition into production and ended up at a visual effects facility here in Toronto in the late 90s, 1997, I think I left.
That's cool. That's really awesome. Yeah, I've met a few of the guys over at Side Effects. Good guys. I think Jeff Wagner, a few of the other ones there. Yeah, good bunch of people. From there, I guess, like, kind of curious, like, what would be your big break? Like, obviously getting into creating software, for you getting into the actual film side of things, like, what was the big blow up point for you?
I think the big sort of moment for me was when I started, the company I started working at is sadly no longer around. They're called Core Digital Pictures. And in the summer, I think, of 97, they were just beginning to work on The Nutty Professor. Sorry, not The Nutty Professor, Dr. Dolittle.
Cool.
And they didn't have any sort of full-time software developers on staff at the time. And so I came on, sort of convinced them that I would be useful, having come from side effects and understanding a lot about the internals of the software. They were just starting to use Houdini, or at least what was to become Houdini at the time. And so I was tasked with writing the software that created the fur on digital rats. And so that was a new experience. And so that was like the first time I actually was able to have a real impact on the end result of a film, which was very exciting and absolutely terrifying at the same time.
That's pretty awesome though. Yeah, I mean, and again, like that was kind of the beginning of the talking animal craze too. So plenty of those kind of projects popping up after that. And you were involved in, I'm just totally stalking your IMDb, but Spawn and The Big Hit around the same time too, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, Spawn, Big Hit was the first time I ever got to go on set for a movie with one of my bosses at the time.
What did you guys do for it? I'm just curious for that film.
Oh, man.
I tried to watch it again just a couple of months ago, but I got about a third of the way through, and I felt like after the action sequence at the beginning, I'm like, I'm good. I know what the rest of the movie's like. So
yeah, it was the 90s, and it was a thing. We did, if I remember correctly, there was a scene where one of the characters is running down a hill and there's a car coming after him and it kind of tumbles end over end. They were supposed to do that practically, and the car never quite flipped the way that they wanted it to. And so we ended up having to do a digital swap out of the car as it was in the air. There was some things, that's sort of whole beat when the car was on the cliff. If I remember, there was a lot back then.
It's towards the end of the movie, I think. I don't know why I know this, but yeah, it's like just after they leave the video store or something and running down the hill. But yeah, that's cool. That's really great. And what about Spawn?
Spawn was interesting. We came into that movie late. And I guess the studio discovered that they had something sort of interesting on their hands, and they threw some extra money at it, and so there was a number of visual effects houses contracted towards the end of the project, and we did a bunch of stuff with his bike, if I remember correctly.
Right.
When he's chasing the clown with I guess he's pouring some gas out of the like a tanker truck or something, and the bike has all of these kind of lightning effects going over it. And so I was helping out with that stuff. That was a fun project I was learning about back then. We got sort of a big piece of the bike that we had to, there was no cyber scanning back then as far as I knew. We had a scanning robot arm basically, where you kind of put the arm point by point on the surface, like it's got a stylus on the end of it, and it's this big multi-segmented arm. I don't remember what it was called. And, we drew, put a little tape all over it so that we knew exactly where the points were, and that turned into a model. It was, that was interesting.
Yeah, it's so funny now to watch like kids being able to just knock stuff out in ZBrush in a couple of hours, whereas you're right, back then I used one of those once. I think you had like a pedal, and you moved the arm around and picked a point, and you're essentially creating vertices for the model. It's not exactly the funnest thing to do. No,
it was it was an interesting thing, and we I think was starting to 2D tracking was starting to become a thing. At that time, there was a product. I think it was called RazTrack from a company called Hammerhead back in the mid to late 90s. And so I was kind of doing a lot of the tracking and learning about that, and also transferring, again, bringing the software thing into it was being able to transfer the tracking data, writing little scripts and programs to transfer the tracking data from there into Houdini. And what was the compositing package there? Was ICE, I think it was called.
Okay.
That they used. And so just being able to take the 2D tracks there and bring those tracks into either the 3D world or the 2D world. So that was, again, I always sort of had a technology focus whenever I was doing things, and that's kind of how they used me, which was a lot of fun.
Cool. No, that's really great. And I was curious about X-Men as well, just in your pre-Soho days.
That was fun, actually. That was one of my last projects before I left Core, if I'm remembering correctly anyway. We did the map table with all of the pins that sort of
I love that.
Made the shapes of the city and what's it called, the Statue of Liberty, which was fun. And that was a big software project. My boss at the time had sort of come up with the sort of plan for how a lot of the pin tables would work, but they were doing it all procedurally in Houdini, and it was very slow. and it needed sort of screamed out for something custom. And so I was able to build a piece of software that allows you to basically physically simulate that pin table. So you could model a shape, put it over top of the table, and then the pins would do sort of a spring simulation and sort of get fired up at the at that shape and sort of bounce as they hit their hit the edge of the surface. And you could actually animate that surface moving around. So in some points of the story, the map sort of zooms in or scales or translates or whatever, and we were able to actually do a full simulation of that. And it was quite a heavy asset, and the rendering of it was intense. We had to come up with sort of a poor man's reflection occlusion back then to try and make it look shiny on the tops of all of those hundreds of thousands of pins. It was really amazing. It was a fun project to work on, and it was a very slow process because the simulations took a long time back then on whatever Silicon Graphics. I think those were pre-Octane days, maybe.
Yeah, Octane was about 2000, I think.
Yeah, so it was it was an interesting process to try and sort of squeeze the most out of it and get, there was a process. The animators had to track the table and the camera, and then we had to run the simulations, then we had to run the lighting simulations, and then we had to do the rendering. So it was sort of an interesting exercise in pipelining a very heavy asset for, as it turns out, when you sort of add it up together, not much screen time, but it sort of left an effect on people. People still ask me about that every now and again.
It definitely spawned, it's kind of like the Matrix, having like bullet ripples in 2000 as well. Like everyone wanted that. And I worked on one commercial, which, again, after seeing X-Men, the client was like, yeah, we want to have this thing. But I think it was like a 1 week turnaround, and it literally was half a day of animating, basically an animatic. And then I wrote a script, which we had to wait a week, and we only had that week for it to actually calculate. And then, so it's kind of like, if this doesn't work out, then, I'm screwed, and I have no idea because I can't see what the computer's doing. So it's kind of checking the computer every day to make sure it didn't crash, and then praying that the result came out good. But that's awesome. Yeah, I was a big fan of that because, again, it's just back then it was a very unique effect compared to like a lot of the other stuff that was kind of rinse and repeat. That's really cool. And I'm curious too, like, so when you guys launched Soho, at the time, I mean, there was a team of you guys, there's a couple of you guys, right? So how did that come to be? Was it just you felt a natural progression after being in the industry for a couple of years that you want to venture out and do your own thing, or is there more to it?
I mean, it was sort of the time was kind of right for us. My business partner and I, his name's Allan Magled. He and I were working together at Core. That's where we met, and we had always, you talk a good game when you're working for somebody. Hey, let's go off and do this thing on our own, and it never really turned into anything. And then we had an opportunity to go build a visual effects department at another company again, who's no longer around, but they were called Soho Post and Graphics. At the time, I think Allan knew somebody that worked there, and they were interested. They were a commercial effects house, and they were interested in getting into film visual effects. And so we said, you know what, let's take the leap. We talked about it long and hard. We were just, each of us, 5-6 years into our career, and we decided, let's just do it. And we jumped in, and that was in, I believe, the winter of 2002, sort of February 2002, when we kind of finally made the jump. And we had a few people with us. We were small, maybe 4 people at the beginning in a tiny little room, just, as many machines, and we had to do everything. I had to set up all the networking and set up the computers, and they had some people there, but they weren't, sort of familiar with this industry. So we had to build it all from scratch, which was a big eye opener. You sort of forget when you leave a big company, and at the time Core was well over 100 people, if I'm not mistaken. You forget the infrastructure that you take for granted, and you have to build it all. We have to do everything. And we did that we worked, as part of Soho for just over a year, I think. And then they wanted to exit the film industry. And so we bought that division from them, and we've been on our own ever since. 15 years now, just past 15 years now. And so it was sort of a series of, what's the worst that could happen, And we decided, let's just jump in with both feet, and we, come hell or high water, here we are.
That's great. And I guess, like, what's it like starting a new company, knowing like, okay, like we're going to be doing something where I think that a lot of people when they are more on the employee end, they don't really think about the responsibility, liability, all the pressure and everything else that comes with running a studio. And for you, was it pretty overwhelming in the beginning, jumping into this and having to grow something up essentially from the ground up?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a combination of exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. We knew how to do what we knew how to do. I knew how to do software and sort of its traditional technical directory sort of things. Allan, my partner, came from an animation background and had transitioned into supervising before we had left core. And so he took most of those duties, any sort of animation, supervising, sort of client side sorts of things were his bag. We had a couple of other guys that were with us as well, doing those sorts of, each person sort of had a task, which is, I think, why it worked out well. And our another business partner who's with us now, Mike Mombourquette, he was there at Soho before we arrived. And so we absorbed him from the other company and we took him away with us. And he had been doing, Inferno work and compositing in the sort of advertising space for a while before then.
Right.
And so each of us sort of had a job to do, which I think made it easier rather than one person having to do everything or us having to hire out, a business manager or to hire a network engineer or whatever. We sort of, by luck or by design, I can't really say, we managed to collect a small team that each brought something to the table. And between all of us, we had sort of made all of the parts of the whole, or as much as we needed to get going. So it's, in that way, we just kind of blissfully went about our business. We just said, well, we know how to do all of these things. We can do it. And then we set about building relationships with clients and with studios and just trying to slowly grow our brand at the time. And so there was a lot of ignorance is bliss in the early days. We didn't know that we could fail. We didn't know it was impossible to have 4 people starting to work on feature films in Hollywood and visual effects. And so we just went and did it. And, we slowly grew over the years, very deliberately.
Cool. No, that's great. And, I think that's right. I mean, going in there in a way with the naivete of not overthinking things, I think is sometimes the best way, because that way you're more aware of what's going on rather than, going in thinking, what has been done before or what is the typical way that things get done. But no, I think that's really great. And for you, I guess, what are some of the biggest challenges with growing a studio over the last 15 years? I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, growing slow in the beginning, which I think is a very smart way, because I've seen so many studios that get a little bit greedy and, take on too much stuff, and it's usually the downfall in the end. But, for you, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges to growing a company steadily over the last, decade and a half?
I think the big thing for us was to be very deliberate about every expansion that we did, to know that we had work in place to support those people, and also to understand what it was we were trying to accomplish with whatever project that we were chasing after or working on. We didn't want to have the situation where we said yes to something that we didn't know how to do. We didn't want to. It's a terrible way to burn a relationship, is to say, oh yeah, I can do this, I can do that, and you take on all of this work, and then you're left holding the bag, and that's that. You don't get a lot of second chances in this industry. If people lose faith in you. And so we really pushed hard to ourselves to say, look, we can chase after this and that, but we have to be certain that it's something that we can deliver at the best of our abilities and whatever the client's quality expectations were. And so each time we went chasing, and we always wanted to do something bigger and better with each project, but we never wanted to get into the situation where it was too much and we just couldn't handle it. We were out of our depth. And so we tried to really research and think very clearly. I'm a very process-driven person. I like to know how things are going to get done before we start doing them, if possible, so that we can say, hey, if we're working on, back in those days, it would have been The Cat in the Hat was one of the first feature films that we worked on. And, we had a certain number of effects. We had some 3D stuff, some 2D stuff. And so we were starting to set up our pipeline around those things and sort of taking my knowledge of how we did things when I was at Side Effects as a software company, and then how we did things when I was at Core as sort of their technology person there, and how all of that worked and what was good there and what was bad there, and just try to forge our own path and do it our own way, the way that we thought was best. Allan is always the one, he's very excitable about the projects and very definitely wants to go and build new work and build the company bigger. I was always the one trying to keep it a little bit smaller and saying, hey, wait a minute, this is too much. And so between the two of us, we managed to find that middle ground of not too conservative and not too much growth, so that we were just able to keep growing steadily.
That's great. I was actually talking to one of the supervisors at Sony in Vancouver yesterday, and we're talking about Frantic Films. We both worked at a long time ago in Winnipeg, and again, like I really love that combination of over there, Chris Bond and Ken Zorniak were two guys that one came from more of a business background, whereas Chris was definitely the creative. And I've always felt like that combination works really well, where you have one person who's more the, I want to do everything and kind of wanting to get their hands into everything, but you have the other person who's more the realist, who's able to kind of taper things back and make more of the decisions that are going to work in both favors. So I mean, I think it's a good combination to kind of have a creative and then also someone else who's kind of more, okay, great, like let's do everything, but what is the right decisions to make. So yeah, I think that's always like a winning combination.
Yeah, I think it's important that that everybody, and then this is really a big part of the way we've always, when we sit and talk, everybody kind of does what they're best at. If if the decisions come down on financial matters or employee matters, then Allan is the one who knows that stuff very well. He'll come to me for my opinion, but at the end of the day, it's up to him to make those decisions, because that's his part of what we do at this company, and that's how we become successful in that way, is because he's the one who knows how to make those decisions, and he's the one who does. Then on the technology side, if we're building some new tools, or if we have to figure out how to accomplish some effect or another, I'll always go to Allan for his advice, because he's been in this industry too. He's not, he started as an artist, just like, everybody at our company. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who's got to kind of make it work. I have to put it together with my team. Now, we have a team. Back then it was just me doing all of it. But now we actually have a team of software developers that we can work with. But at the end of the day, I've got to make those decisions and live with them, and stick by them. So it's good. And I think it's a good thing for companies or people who are thinking about setting up companies to think about, is say, hey, what's each person going to do? Because if everybody tries to do the same job, then nothing's going to get done, and there's going to be a lot of friction. But if everybody knows what they and what everybody else is good at, I think that leads to a very smooth process, or it should anyway.
That's great. That's really cool. And again, you guys have worked on so many massive projects, and a lot of them. For you, what do you think have been some of the more challenging projects over the history of Soho VFX?
I think we've gotten a lot of sort of big effects that we've had to do over the years, and sort of at each step, it's kind of I guess a cliche thing to say, but sort of at each step, it was the most challenging thing we had ever done. Mm-hmm. And again, equal parts exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. But the first big exposure we had to that world was Fantastic Four, the first one,
right?
Where the supervisor on that project, Kurt Williams, was somebody we had met during the Cat in the Hat days. He was the supervisor on that project, and we had sort of formed a relationship with him. And so when it came time to do that, we were able to get on board and take charge of the Mr. Fantastic character. So all of the stretching skin and all of that part, and a number of other effects as well. But that was definitely a big step for us, taking on that volume of work. There was a lot of shots, a lot of work to be done, a lot of complicated work, a fully digital character for the first time for us, and also a central point of the movie, not just some sort of, side bit or something. And so
a gag here or there or whatever. It's
exactly. And so that, writing all from my end, writing all of the software for his, all kinds of crazy new rigging that we had to do for his stretching arms, and early on in the script, there was a stretching sort of a neck gag, and his body stretches, all of these things. And it was a rigging and an animation challenge. And so we came up with some really clever rigs for having a character that can stretch to some infinite level.
What
And
was it,
also,
like Spline IK, or how did you guys approach
it
it?
was a kind of crazy combination of a bunch of things where we were kind of doing a sort of a spline IK thing, but it allowed us, the way that I wrote it was that it would allow us to insert an arbitrary number of handles along the curve so that it
Mm-hmm.
could be infinitely posed. If it needed to wrap around something,
Yep.
you would need 100 handles, but if he just needed to stretch from point A to point B, he made maybe only 4 handles. And so rather than baking in a massive number of handles, we gave the animators the ability to click on a handle and say, insert a handle before or after here, and then continue animating. And controlling how much stretch would happen and twist along the arm so that we could still keep. One of the things that they wanted to make sure of was that his arm or his torso would still look like what it was rather than just becoming a noodle.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to make sure that the shape of the actor's arm stayed looking like an arm no matter what it was. And so there was hair on his arm, and there was the skin had to stretch in a somewhat sensible way, which means that you can't just take the texture that's there and just stretch it out. It'll look terrible. And so we needed ways to kind of replicate the texture along that now 20-foot long arm so that it looked like real skin. So that was a very interesting challenge. We've used that rig a few times over the years. Not as much in the past. The software sort of caught up with being able to do some of those things, but back then, 2000 and I want to say 4.
It's 2000. Yeah, the movie came out in 2005. It was the first movie I ever saw in a Canadian theater, if that's some giant landmark of something. But no, because I remember again I was working on I think I was on pre-production for Superman in Winnipeg, which I just mentioned actually. So we all went and saw that film. So yeah, very familiar with it.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was fun. It was a lot of work. It was more work than we expected it to be. And I know that Kurt and the studio had put a lot of faith in us to complete the work. Again, this is the flip side of getting something big and cool, and a huge part of the movie is that all eyes are on you. He was one of the 4 major characters in the film. And so there's a certain amount of sort of pride and responsibility there that we can't let down somebody that's put so much faith in us. And so we pushed through very hard and, made some missteps along the way. I think that, it was a much more complicated project than it should have been for us. I think if we had been a bit more process minded and done things a little bit differently. But again, we were still only 3 years out from our beginning, and we were still learning and sort of finding our feet. If we had to do that again, it definitely would be a much simpler process.
Yeah, and that's all part of it. I mean, but that's really cool. I mean, especially so early into it, I think that all of those lessons are really valuable to kind of help you, make a bulletproof pipeline for, next project and next project after that.
Yeah, that was early on. I'm trying to remember the order of things. I kind of remember when that we did things, but not when. But I believe the next sort of big comic booky movie was X-Men 3, if I'm not mistaken. And that one, again, we had a bunch of characters, one of whom had, I think he was just called Quill. He had a bunch of sort of porcupine quills that came out of his body.
Right.
And we had a cyber scan of the actor's face, and we built all of the quills and textured them and were able to animate them. And that all went very smoothly. But we were plagued by all sorts of software problems. We were in a world, not to get too technical, but our pipeline was sort of based on, at the time, this would have been Maya 6.5, maybe something like that. It was just a series of references. The modeler would build a file and then pass it on to the rigger, who would reference in the model and do all of his rigging work. And then all of the animators would then reference in that rigging file. And then the lighter would reference in the rigging, the animator's file with another reference of all of the shader assignments and all of that business back then. And it was constantly breaking. The Maya files wouldn't load, and we would have all sorts of problems. All the shaders would detach for some crazy reason. Nobody knew why.
Yeah, rule of thumb for me was always save as Maya ASCII, because at least you can open up the ASCII file and start trying to pull stuff out of it again.
That's exactly the world that we were in. It's exactly it. So I'll just load, one of the lighters would say, hey, I can't load my file anymore. I said, okay, just send me the ASCII file and I'll figure it out and reassemble it somehow. So we went through a lot of pain on that process-wise, just because, we had the software was unstable and our pipeline wasn't necessarily the smartest way to do things. But we went through it. We just said, we've got to just get through it. We can't rebuild the bike while we're riding it. But after that, I swore never again. We would never go through that kind of pain, sort of too loosey-goosey a pipeline. And so when we started our next project very shortly after, which was the Chronicles of Narnia, and we did 2 stints on the Chronicles of Narnia. We did during the movie. I don't really remember what we did during the full movie, but then during they had a DVD special release sort of thing, and they wanted to extend the big battle scenes at the end of the movie. Mm-hmm. And so they contracted us to basically rebuild, retexture all of the characters that Rhythm and Hughes had done for the movie, just to add in, a few shots here and there. I think we did maybe 60 or 70 shots. Mm-hmm. But we had to rebuild all of these characters. We had tens of characters that needed fur and skin and cloth and all of these things and big crowd simulations. And so in a panic, I said, we can't do this movie I think we only had 3 or 4 months from start to finish. Wow. We can't do it the way we've been doing it before. And so I finally put my foot down and said, we're building a real pipeline, a proper way of doing things where we won't depend on referencing. We won't, and just to say all of these problems that we've had, we're going to now take all of those painful lessons and learn from them. And so again, in a sort of fit of madness, I just started writing software. I said, okay, look, I'm going to sit with the modelers. Let's see what they need, the riggers in each, sort of department. And I was able to, again, luckily, probably I'll say by design, but I don't think it was just blind luck, that each piece of the pipeline was finished when that department needed to start working. Perfect. So when the modelers were modeling, we had that part. When the riggers needed to start, I had finally just finished that. And then the lighting and shading was the worst part. And that took the longest. And I had to rewrite our first software, I think, for maybe the second or third time at that point. And so that was finished, again, just at the right time for it to get done. But that project was the birth of our asset management system and our pipeline, which has served us very well over the last, when would that have been, 2006 maybe? Mm-hmm. Maybe 2007, I don't remember. But yeah, that in some incarnation, that asset management philosophy has stayed with us all the way through. And it's worked very well, and it helps our projects go a lot more smoothly than they ever have.
That's so cool. Yeah, and I've always found, like, whenever studios do kind of start to personalize things, like as in sit down with the teams, and the more often the better, but just kind of see like where the big bottlenecks are and what needs to be ironed out, or what would be in a perfect scenario the tools or the process that each department needs, and kind of having that bird's eye view of seeing it all come together. It's always just drastically changed, like a very pivotally changed the way that those studios tend to work, and then the results as well. So I mean, I think that's pretty awesome to kind of have that, like, let's sit down and build a better, whatever the metaphor might be in this case. For you guys, like, what was so different between, let's say, the out of the box asset tools that you guys were using and the ones that you developed?
Well, at that time, there really weren't any. That was sort of the thing. I mean, we've come into a world where now there's sort of any number of different tools that you can use to manage a pipeline. But back when I was starting that stuff, there was, at least that I could tell from a little bit of research, there wasn't anything that I could draw on. There was no product to buy that somebody had done. And so it was really about finding the process for us. And I mean, part of that, I'm sure, is, when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And so I'm a software developer and I see problems. I'm making a piece of software to fix it. And, but I'd have to think about the timelines, but I'm pretty sure there was no existing product that certainly was available to us that we could use at the time in order to work our pipeline. And I've come also to the thinking, if I was to do it again with whatever tool you might have, the problem I see with those tools, at least in the way that, and sort of in the culture of our company and the way that I tend to think as a technology person, is that I typically don't want software that will change our way of doing things. I want to change the software to conform to our way of doing things. And especially something as fundamental as a pipeline, the way that you get from modeling and film scans all the way to finished composited images. is fundamental to the way that we work. And if that tool doesn't work exactly the way we want, then we're going to introduce all sorts of inefficiencies and frustrations for the artists. I'm a big believer that artists should spend their time doing artistic work and not wrestling with technological problems.
Right.
And any time that they have to, it's always taking away from the work that they want to do and what they should be doing, which is creating these effects and working on these movies. So, I mean, we'll never get to the perfection of that idea, but every decision along the way has always been, how do we make it easier for them to work? And, staff comes and goes. We still have our original employee, actually, the first person that we hired.
That's great.
Is still with us doing modeling work, but we have a number of people that are in the 10-year range. And so we sort of have built up a mind share, but at the same time, you don't grow without bringing in new people, and, people come and go. And so the pipeline is sort of, our asset management is the one constant in all of that. So that, there's sort of way of doing things that you can depend on. And so off the shelf tools are a little too invasive in that way. I want to be able to say, this is the way that we're going to do it, for better or for worse. You make a decision and you kind of stick to it as best you can until it becomes a problem. But so far it's just, this is our way of doing things, and I want to keep doing it this way because it seems to be working. And, as we learn new things, we do things a little bit differently. All of our tools typically, we don't just grow them and evolve the individual tools over time. I've become a big fan of just throwing out the old one and starting again, learning from the lessons of the previous one, spend some time not reusing the software, but reusing all of the ideas and lessons of that software. And so I think that rolling our own completely allows us to do that sort of thing. We're not beholden to somebody else's ideas of the way that a pipeline should work.
Cool. No, that's great. That's really cool. Yeah, and I guess just while we're on the subject, I mean, what other projects have there been, any tremendously challenging ones that kind of stand out for you in addition to the ones you mentioned?
Oh, wow. I mean, pretty much every comic book movie we've ever done has been, in its own way, a ridiculous challenge. The Incredible Hulk was, massive in terms of so many ways. The number of staff, I think we were at our largest for a number of years during The Incredible Hulk. And again, there's a big main character in a movie. We were working again with Revenant Hughes. They were doing kind of the bulk of the characters, but we had to do a section of that movie where, two sections actually. The bottling plant fight at the beginning, where we first see him as the Hulk. Aside from one or two shots, I think that big close-up of his face was Revenant Hughes, but the rest of that kind of battle was something that we had to do. And then the sort of chase along the rooftop when the helicopter gunship was shooting at them right before the final battle.
Right.
And that was the largest amount of all CG work we had done. Basically, from the moment that they start climbing the building till almost the very end, it's almost entirely digital. And that was a massive challenge just in terms of the size of the assets and the number of texture maps. Having to match the character that Revenant Hughes had spent all these months developing. They would send us the model with all of the texture maps, and a bunch of turntables, but it was up to us to redo the rigging, redo all of the shading, and make his, all of the skin. That was a big challenge. And but amazingly, it went much more smoothly, for example, than Fantastic Four, because we had learned, we can't get ourselves into these big kind of procedural messes. We have to sort of take the bull by the horns and just make it work.
Yeah.
And so,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just that really is the thing that you've got to do is constantly learn your lessons. You can't get into the same quagmires one project after the other. And we've always promised ourselves, hey, if we're suffering on this project, we may suffer on the next one, but not in the same way. We'll never make the same mistake twice.
That's great. Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I feel like everything, especially with business, is always going to be, and production too, is always the lessons that you get from it. So having, unique challenges down the line, like, you fast forward 5 years or however long it was, it's one of those things where you're confidently knowing you're not going to run into the same issues because you've been there before. So you're not going to repeat those mistakes. You're more well equipped to handle them.
Yeah, and it's sort of a promise we try to make to our staff as well, that if they've had a tough time with something on this project, we'll, again, we'll never reach the perfection of that. It's impossible, but we'll try to make sure that they won't, be struggling through the same swamp from project to project to project, that it never changes. We'll always try to improve things whenever we can and try to make it better. And, I think we're doing a pretty good job of it. And I think that the artists enjoy the ability to kind of work in that environment when they can, which is great.
Cool, that's great. And just to touch on, I guess, like Logan, I could mention all the amazing projects you guys have done, but I was curious about that one. Like, what were the contributions you guys had for that film?
Logan was a real treasure to work on. That was
I love that film.
Yeah, it was another movie with Kurt Williams. We have a long history of working with Kurt. We're working with him now on X-Men Dark Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
And Logan was with him and a new supervisor we'd never worked with named Chaz Jarrett. And it was just a remarkable project to work on from beginning to end. And our responsibility was kind of throughout the movie, kind of from beginning to end. The big sequence, the big single sequence would have been the chase just after the what's the main bad guy's name? Pierce arrives at the plant and they start chasing in the limo, and they get in the limo and they're trying to drive away. We took over that section up until they get past the train. So there's the crash into the fence, and then they back up, and the motorcycles are chasing them. So there was a lot of digital limousine, digital fence, digital guys on motorcycles. The train was all digital. And Pierce's hand, the robotic hand of that main kind of bad guy, we had that throughout the movie, which was a really amazing thing to work on, because they gave us just some artwork, sort of front of hand, back of hand, 2D artwork, and said, this is what we want it to look like, but now make it into a real thing that could actually work in this world. And we love it. I always love working on things that could exist in the real world if the technology existed to make them. And so we really tried to make this hand a real thing, something that was, could really be used by this sort of person in this sort of world. And, to make it respond to the light in the way that it really would, and covered in dirt and scratches. And one of the things they wanted is, this idea that the hand was something that he was repairing constantly. And so not all of the screws matched. He would just find some, little piece of hardware to bolt on. There was stickers on it. There was, it was a really fun idea, and making it work in that world, to hold a gun and to, we got some pretty up close stuff with that, which was fun. And cool. Then we also at the end, there was a number of things throughout the middle of the film as well, and a lot to do with Pierce's hand and some vehicles and that. But then at the end, there's the moment where Logan is fighting with X-24, I think they call him, his twin, and the little kid lifts the truck up in the air and smashes it down on top of him. That was an all digital effect. That truck was, we had one on set, but it was, we ended up, starting from a clean plate and just lifting up a digital model of it with all of the dynamics and work that went along with that. So it was a really, really fun project, and we're super, super proud of being involved in it, because it was an amazing movie and an amazing team, and everybody on the show, Image Engine, and I think Rising Sun was also on it. Everybody brought their A game to that movie, and it really, really shows on the screen.
Yeah, no, I love that film. I kind of got mad within 5 minutes of watching it, just because I'm just thinking how greater all the other films could have been if they just kind of focused on just making them a bit more like that. I think it was amazing, and everyone's contributions were really great in that film. No,
I was just going to say, I just agree that you really made a different sort of superhero movie that we had never seen before. And it was more like a Western than a big sci-fi epic. The stakes were very human in that movie. And I think that everybody in our office, from supervisor Keith Sellers and Kelly, who's our producer, everybody bought on. Everybody signed on for this. We're making this amazing thing, and you could sort of tell that it was going to be amazing while we were making it. And it was all hands on deck. It was really, really exciting.
It's cool. And just in terms of your team, I'm kind of curious, like, what your thoughts are on artists kind of bridging between being creative and technical, I do think that it's beneficial, not obviously a requirement, but beneficial to artists if they do learn to code a little bit or learn to script and build their own tools, things like that?
Well, it certainly can't hurt. I come from a world, and you, I'm sure, in the same way. In the 90s, kind of everything was done by generalists. Typically back then, in terms of the number of shots that we were doing and the kind of work that we were doing, one artist would get the shot from beginning to end.
I still think, honestly, that's like I encourage everyone to kind of go that path before they specialize, because I'd never seen that before I came to the States, where people literally just came into one discipline. And so you'd ask them like, hey, can you just change the texture a little bit, or, you know, fix this one thing? And it's just like, oh, I don't know how to do that. And it kind of shocked me, because you're right. Like, especially back then, you need to understand the whole spectrum. And then from there, you kind of naturally evolve into one area or another.
Yeah. And I think the industry, from a scale standpoint, I mean, back then, I mean, if you think to Jurassic Park, I may be pulling this number out of my backside, but I think there was on the order of 60 or 70 digital shots in that movie. And now, you know, there's hundreds and a couple of thousands of shots in a movie. And so out of necessity, you kind of have to pipeline things a little bit. But you know, and so even with us, we have 100 people, a little bit more than 100 now. And we have a lighting department and a texturing department and, you know, modeling and rigging and compositing and dynamics. Everybody's kind of in their lane. But at the same time, it's very good for people to, even if they can't do the other tasks, to at least understand what's going on before them in the pipeline and after, so that the decisions that they make when they're doing whatever it is that they're doing, they're at least mindful of what it is that has to happen next. So when you're building a model, you have to think, one, can this even be rigged? You know, is it too complicated, or is it not complicated enough? And the rigger has to understand what the animators are doing. They may not be able to animate themselves, but at least they're in communication. They're all sitting together, and we encourage that sort of collaboration in that way. And so when you think to the more technical stuff, when somebody needs to do some scripting or coding, I mean, we have, like I said, we have a team of software developers whose job it is to make those big tools and to write those scripts and to do those things. But at the same time, if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I wrote this little thing and I want to do that, I say, yeah, that's great. You know, if this is something that makes your job easier, or one of your colleagues' jobs easier, then why not? It would be silly for me to discourage that. What typically happens from my standpoint, I'm a little bit of a control freak this way. So, you know, a lot of the artists, we've had a lot of people in modeling and dynamics, texture artists, they're constantly trying to do, you know, to find new scripts. Even the compositors, you know, Nuke is great with gizmos and Python scripting and all of that. They all do whatever they feel like doing. But I encourage them to come, first of all, to talk to me or somebody on the team to understand the part of the pipeline that they're playing around in, so that they don't do something that kind of goes counter to the philosophy or the rules of the way that we do things. And so we can sort of advise them and say, hey, if you're going to do this, this is a great idea, but maybe do it kind of this way. And so they can, you know, we make a little bit of a software developer out of them by having them be a little bit more engineering minded rather than task minded. And then if this tool becomes something that's bigger than that one little moment, then usually we will absorb it as a task for the software development team to turn into something a bit more robust and long lasting. So we'll, you know, if somebody's got a great idea for something, you know, on the modeling side or whatever, it's great. And I let them kind of, with impunity, just kind of do what they feel is right, as long as I feel like it's not encouraging bad habits or bad ways of doing things. Then I think it's a great thing. I think it's the way that any company should run, because it lets people kind of be free to be creative in whatever ways. You know, ultimately, all of these are very creative people, and you can't kind of stifle that.
That's right. That's right. And I guess I go on to last questions, but in terms of the artists that typically apply and try and come in, like, do you see any common kind of red flags or bad practices that certain people have when they're applying? Again, I think it's just really beneficial for people who probably aren't aware of like the mistakes that they are making when they're like sending their work in, applying for a specific position.
I don't. I'm sort of the wrong person to direct that at. I don't do a lot of the interviewing and kind of onboarding of the staff when they come, but I do kind of know what I see when I'm working on a project or when we're when we're finding staff to do certain tasks, I think it's really important for people to have a very good understanding of what their abilities are. And there's no shame in not being good at something or trying to get better at something. But it's not necessarily a good thing for anybody to say that, hey, I can do this and I know how to do that, and then find out, well, they don't really, or not up to the level. If somebody's coming from a different industry, the constraints are different. In our industry, and we really push for a lot of physical realism and a lot of accuracy in what we do, and we have the time scales to be able to do it. Other industries, they don't have any time at all. You've got to take an episode of television from script to finished shots in a couple of weeks. I mean, we've barely built a model in that time, and because we have, so you kind of have to find those all of the different compromises that each industry makes. And if you're trying to move from one to the other, it's a good idea to understand how those industries worked. If I had to go and write software at a game engine, a gaming facility, or even in a commercial house, I'd be completely lost because it's a different set of pressures and a different set of requirements.
Right.
So I think it's important for people to understand that. And I think to understand kind of where they are in the world and where they are in the pipeline in terms of what their expectations of what sort of work they're going to get at the beginning. If you're very junior, you're going to get very junior work, but hard work pays, and I think any good company will notice and reward that hard work when people, even if they can't, we don't expect somebody to be able to be perfect the first day that they start. But they always have to work as hard as they can. And if they have problems, that they ask for help. One of the worst things, one of the lessons we learned early on and with great pain, is to not necessarily believe people when they say everything's fine, because you'll end up, at the end of a project and the shot's not done. So constant communication that way. We do a lot of reviews, and supervisors are in the screening room, multiple 3-4 times a day, looking at shots and keeping track and saying, hey, if you need some help, just let us know, and we can get somebody to help you do some rotos on this shot or do a little bit of animation or something.
Yeah.
Asking for help is considered a good thing, not a bad thing.
No, I like I said, I was just talking about very similar subjects yesterday, because I think that you really hit the nail on the head with all of those remarks. I mean, I think that typically the whole fake it till you make it kind of mentality, where people think like, well, let's say I don't know the software the studio uses, I'll just say that I do and then go in and I'll figure it out. Like, there's so many times where you can shoot yourself in the foot way worse than just saying no, or explaining like, look, I know a little bit, I'm willing to learn, but at least like setting that, kind of calibrating everyone to the same level of expectation. I think that, if you were applying for a job and you don't know the software, then having learned it a little bit and then communicating like, look, I'm learning it, I'm willing to put in the extra hours and get up to speed, and let them kind of make that decision about whether they want to bring you on. At least that way they're not expecting the output to be at a high level, but there's nothing positive that's going to come from kind of coming in with everyone expecting your output to be very high and then not being able to fulfill that. And it's the same way that I think that a lot of, especially juniors, they think that asking for help means that you're not capable of finishing a job or doing something. And it's the same way that you'll get people who kind of slip under the radar and don't show anything for a long time. And so what could have been a simple, management fix ends up being like a major problem, because, things aren't where they should be schedule wise. And you've got to now really drastically change how you're doing things. So, I mean, all these kind of little things that people think like, hey, if I ask for help, that means that I'm not capable of doing my job, when really it's like, hey, we just got to shuffle a few things around and continue moving forward, rather than it being like a actual problem.
Yeah, and I think this is a young person's industry, and young people have a lot of pride in what they're doing, which is great. That's what, you want people to have pride in their work, but there is a certain aspect of, oh, it's mine, and if I, show that weakness, then it's not mine anymore, and they're going to take it away from me, or, a lot of these thoughts that aren't necessarily true, but they sort of make sense, when you think back about why somebody ends up in that mindset. But you try to discourage it as best you can in this business. And, we've had staffers that started to work with us, in one department, and turns out they were terrible at it. They were, an awful animator or a terrible compositor, but turns out they were, really good at modeling or really good at rigging or something, and they just move over. It's not, we're not looking, there's not some big gotcha, you can't composite, out you go. If there's some aptitude, we try to, our staff are human beings. They want to work and they want to be creative and they want to do things. And so we try to find those worlds where, if we can, if somebody's got some aptitude, we're not interested in just giving them the old heave-ho if they can't do this thing, or maybe there's a certain kind of compositing or a certain kind of modeling that this person's good at, and we know, and that's, all of these things are management issues. Anytime that those things break down, I'm a big believer that it's a failure in management. It's a failure on our side that we didn't find a way to make that work. But yeah, if somebody's not so good at modeling, hard physical objects, but holy crap, they're amazing at modeling characters and these things. So then we tailor the work so that we make sure we assign people their tasks with a mind to success. It's that, why give somebody something that they're not going to be very good at?
That's right.
But, and especially since there's a lot of work to go around, it's not like there's any shortage of shots to pass out. So we always try and sit down and say, okay, who's going to be good at this shot? Who's too junior to pass on this complicated work, but maybe they could take 2 or 3 of these simpler shots, and start to build their confidence. And that's on us as the owners and managers of the company to sort of engender that if we can.
It's really cool. And I guess my last question is more something that you touched on briefly, was just, what's the review process like at your company? I mean, do you guys do, let's say, dailies in the morning, then do rounds at night, or are you constantly just doing dailies like in the review room all day long, or how typically do you guys work?
Nowadays, we're typically more review heavy than rounds heavy. There's a lot of people in the office now. And so we used to do, as a supervisor, when I was supervising more. Nowadays, it's rare for me to supervise a show. But there was sort of a process of, sit in the screening room and look at the work, and then, okay, let's go from desk to desk and kind of see what everybody's doing. But we've been finding that that's a bit distracting. There's a lot of noise around everybody when you're talking and trying, it's hard to focus on what you're doing. And there's just so many people to go. It takes too much time to go from place to place. And so better to bring everybody in. And so we're typically on any one show. So for example, with Tomb Raider most recently that I was working on, we would have a review first thing in the morning for whatever work people finished the night before, or, if somebody was in before, say, 10 o'clock, we'd have a review at 10 or 11 in the morning and go over that day's work and see what there is. And if on that show things were mostly the same task, we were doing sort of this digital environment of Hong Kong was the big task that we did on that, as she's sort of chasing these kids to the Endurance, to the boat that she gets on. And so everybody's tasks were basically the same. And so we would just go over the shots as they were finished, and, with a mind to deadlines and saying, okay, hey, you've got to show us this work today or this work tomorrow. And then we would repeat. We would have a review in the morning, another one in the afternoon, another one in the evening, just before we made our deliveries. If there's on a, for example, a show like X-Men, when there's a heavy modeling component, a heavy animation component, rigging, all of these things. So each department will have their reviews as well. So the leads, the lead modeler will bring everybody in, and probably the supervisor and the producer, they'll come in. Let's look at all the models and see what's being done. Texturing will probably happen at the same time. Animation reviews, we try to, most reviews we try to filter through the various department leads up to the main supervisor and producer on the show, just so that, otherwise you'll be in the screening room all day. You may as well just live in there. Yeah. So, the animation supervisor's in charge of watching over all of that work until it gets to a level of quality that says, okay, well, I'm going to show Keith my shot because Keith's got to finally sign off on it, but I'm not going to waste his time with some little animation fixes that he shouldn't have to worry about because he's got 500 shots that he's got to deal with. And so we try to pipeline even that, to streamline it a little bit, just so that everybody's making the best use out of their time. And we try to bring in the team together. We look at a bunch of shots. I'll typically look at them a little bit beforehand, just to sort of get a sense of what I'm looking at. Then we bring the team in. Everybody gets the notes in front of everybody else. It is a collaborative effort. We fail and succeed together. No one person is the success or failure of any project. So I think it's useful, illuminating for people to hear everybody else's notes. and to see all of the work that people are up to. And maybe they have, some comment to say, oh, hey, I did this thing on this shot and I found a really cool way to fix that. And then, off they go after the review and go and kind of figure that problem out together.
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep everyone else included, because it's so easy to kind of get in the trenches and feel kind of alone in terms of the shot or sequence you're doing, and just getting to see what everyone else is doing and remember it's a collaborative effort and that we're all kind of working on the project and what everyone else is doing. It can be pretty inspiring, especially if you are in a rut or just kind of feeling alone in terms of the challenges that you're dealing with. So yeah, I think it's always powerful.
Yeah, and I think that they're a team. They work together. They sit mainly in silence, but next to each other. They're with each other all day. I mean, we try not to go crazy with overtime anymore. I've worked in places where the hours are too long, so we try to. There's always going to be some deadline pressure on these shows, but we try to keep that to as much of a minimum as we can. But still, it's a stressful environment. There's deadlines. People have to work. And so we try to make sure that they feel like they've got some support and that they're all in it together. I think that's really the biggest thing, the best thing that any company can do for themselves and for their staff is say, look, this isn't all on you and it's not all on me. We've got to succeed at this together. And if we don't, then it's on all of us. If one person falls down, then we're all going down with them. So,
That's cool. And where can people go to find out more about Soho VFX?
I think just our website is the best place to go, sohovfx.com. Mm-hmm. I think there's a redesign in the offing, but it's everything's there. I think we've got our job postings and a couple of reels on there, and just people can go and see what we've done. And it's a great way just to, if they need to get in contact, if they want to send a resume, anything like that, all of those links are there.
Cool. That's awesome. And I'll definitely link to it in the show notes. Again, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat. This has been really great.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm glad. Hopefully you got some interesting information for people.
All right. So I want to thank Berj for taking the time to chat. This is really insightful. And again, really fun to do this episode. And as I quickly wanted to mention, if you're interested in the FXTD mentorship, registration is open right now. On top of that, I've got that new 7-video, 8-hour free visual effects training available at allanmckay.com/plasma. So check that out right now. Next episode, I'm going to be speaking with Brad Alexander from Halon. He's one of the founders and talking a lot about his background starting out in 3D and pretty much going straight into Lucasfilm, which he's not the only person. I've got a few episodes coming up pretty soon where it seems like everyone got their start working directly with George Lucas. So I think it's going to be a really fun episode, and we get into a lot of really cool stuff. It's very high energy, a lot of fun. So that'll be coming up next. And again, I want to thank Burch again for taking time for this episode. And that is it. So I'll be back next week. Until then, rock on.